you look from the side, you would see 5 main structures above the spinal cord, again starting from the bottom: the brainstem, the cerebellum, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and finally the cerebrum. The brainstem has 2 functions. 1. First, the brainstem governs basic survival, such as breathing, circulation, digestion, and swallowing. Do you see how well protected the brainstem is? That's because damage to the brainstem can make life hard to sustain. The second function of the brainstem is to pass routine sensory input motor information from the spinal cord to the appropriate part of the brain and back again. The cerebellum is located behind the brainstem. It controls your body's motor functions, balance, coordination, and motor memory. Athletes have a lot to thank their cerebellum for. The thalamus sits on top of the brainstem, and it's like the dispatch center for your brain. It sorts through data and then routes the data to where it needs to go in your brain. The hypothalamus is directly below the thalamus. It's a small structure, about the size of a grape, but it's vitally important because it's responsible for maintaining optimal functioning in your body, such as temperature and your circadian rhythm. Below that is your pituitary gland. The anterior part governs the endocrine system, so this is what keeps your hormones balanced. The posterior part is part of the nervous system and also releases some hormones, including oxytocin, the love hormone. At the top of the brain is the cerebrum, the largest part of the brain. It makes up 80% of your brain, and it has 2 connected hemispheres, one on the right and one on the left. The cerebrum controls your voluntary functions, including your willpower, reasoning, thinking, speech, and much more. Your brain's cortex is the thin outer layer of the cerebrum. It is only about 1/10 of an inch thick, but it has 10 billion nerve cells, about 10% of the brain's total neurons. In the past, scientists have tried to map what each part of the cortex does, but more recently, functional MRIs are showing how integrated the work of the cortex is. So what I'm about to say may change in the coming years. For now, however, the cortex is generally described as having 4 lobes, each with different functions. Remember that there are 2 of each lobe I describe, one in the right hemisphere and one in the left hemisphere. The frontal lobe is the CEO of the brain, and this is where rational thought occurs. Part of the frontal lobe's executive function is to control emotions and social responses. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that the frontal lobe of people living with dementia has been damaged. We'll be talking more about that. The parietal lobe is behind the frontal lobe at the top of the brain. This helps us interpret sensory input from our environment, and it is also vulnerable to damage with dementia. The occipital lobe is behind the parietal lobe. Its primary function is vision. It is rarely damaged by dementia. The temporal lobe is beneath these other lobes, and it is very important for language, learning, and memory. You'll be hearing more about 2 structures in the temporal lobe. The hippocampus. A healthy hippocampus makes learning and memory formation possible. Unfortunately, the hippocampus is extremely vulnerable to damage from diseases related to dementia. The amygdala. The amygdala produces emotional responses to situations. These are the responses that can fail to be moderated by the frontal cortex in a person living with dementia. This ends our tour of the brain. As a quick review, let's go back through the brain. We have the amygdala and hippocampus, which are part of the temporal lobe of the cortex. We also have the occipital, parietal, and frontal lobes of the cortex, which is the thin outer layer of the much larger cerebrum. We have the thalamus and the hypothalamus, the cerebellum, and the brainstem, and finally, the spinal cord.